everyone, it's lovely to be here. So my name is Jo Stansfield, as you can see, much younger picture of me on screen there, so you can look at the photo rather than the real thing. I'm founder and director, as it says, of a social enterprise called Inclusioneering Limited, and we support tech and engineering firms with diversity and inclusion consultancy. But we sort of see that through to the outcomes of that as well, so really looking at what I call inclusive innovation, so how people go about doing their kind of IT and engineering processes and the impacts and the equitable outcomes of those things. So that's my business. I'm also co-chair of BCS Women and a member of BCS Council and Trustee Board.
And Tricia?
Thank you, Jo. And like Jo, thank you for having me here this evening. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Tricia Phillips. So within the past year, I've been promoted to the managing partner of Cadence Innova. We are an SME specialising in transformation in the public sector. In just recently, for our 5th year running, we were identified as a leading consulting firm by the Financial Times. So very proud of that. We have a very diverse group, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more during the next hour that we have together. So thank you again for inviting me.
And Andrea.
Hi. So I'm the chair of BCS Women. I also sit on FTAC. I was on council for 2 terms, but that just finished a month ago. I am also a consultant for Emphasis Consulting as part of my day job.
Thank you very much, Simon, for introducing everything. Thank you very much to the rest of the panelists joining in. And thank you for the audience for your patience as well. I'm Antonio, the chairperson of the BCS Consultancy Specialist Group. We have organized this, as Andrea was mentioning before, together with BCS Women. It's the 3rd time that we are running this show on an annual basis. I want to say thanks to BCS Women for the cooperation and the help putting this together, which will be recorded and shared after the meeting. Today we have 3 of our panelists.
We've lost Rebecca.
You've lost Rebecca, right?
We're not quite sure where she is.
All right, so we have 3 of the panel that we were discussing, we have been mentioning, and we were going to be talking about challenges that female leaders, like the people in the panel, have been found and how we can address some of these topics. Thank you very much. We have been discussing internally. We were discussing to bring 3 topics out, and I'm going to be asking questions to the 3 panelists. Then we will move into a more Q&A oriented session, and then we have a networking area for later. In terms of the first topic, was about women in the workplace, inclusivity, diversity, and belonging. So the main question that came up when we were talking about that is how someone, and in this case, how a woman can show authenticity? Can they have inspired that authenticity when you are the only different person in a group? So I'm just going to do a round robin. I'm going to take a few words from each of you. I will start. I think in the panel in the room, we can see that we have, anti-clockwise, we have Tricia, Jo, and Andrea. So Tricia, I hope you don't mind that I go with you first. And yeah, so what are your thoughts? How someone can demonstrate and be authentic when you are surrounded and everybody else is from a very different background? In this case, is women and the standard white male like me.
It can be quite difficult, and I think this is where women supporting each other in terms of building the confidence to be in a room and know that actually all organisations are striving for diversity. So actually, whilst you might be different, that is a plus point now, as opposed to actually everyone trying to get you to leave the room. So I think we've come some way in terms of accepting that bringing that difference is powerful for an organisation at every level. I think I often mentor young women, and one of the people that I followed is an American study conducted by a woman called Amy Cuddy, and her view is around how often women present as small. So she did quite a lot of study in body language, and often women will, we teach young girls to sit quietly, cross their legs, hold their hands in their lap. But yeah, we see men splay, and that's particularly true in a work setting, in a meeting room. And so often I work with women who are working in male-dominated environments. And a couple of things that we talk about is actually own your space. So don't make yourself small, own your space. But also, and I think we may all have seen this, don't be the first one to bring out the pad and the pencil, because that can, in effect, play into this notion that you're going to take the notes. And as a consequence of that behaviour, it's accepted that you're going to take the notes. And then we're playing back into the stereotypical kind of things that we've tried so desperately to move away from in the workplace. So for me, it's about kind of really being true to yourself. We've come a long way. We have a place in the room. Own it. I think that's pretty much the only thing I would say, and help other women to do it, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tricia.
And I can build on what Tricia's just said. Is Amy Cuddy's done some really good research, not just in that, but also about being introverts. She's got a really good TED talk. If you haven't listened to that, I would thoroughly recommend listening to that. And that is, how do you get people's voices into the room? It's quite difficult sometimes, and I've experienced it myself, where I'm normally quite quiet. I am naturally an introvert, although lots of people go, really? And I go, well, yeah, I've had to learn to do things differently. And part of that was learning to project my voice into a room. And don't wait politely, which is the way that I was brought up in my generation, is you wait till everyone more senior than you has spoken. And then by the time it gets to you, you end up going, I don't have anything else to say because someone else has said it. So it's learning to find a way to get your voice into the room early and don't wait. And that may be just to go hello, but you do it hello. You lower it just to get your voice in, and similar to the guys, and people stop and they listen, and then you can carry on as yourself. You don't need to mask the whole time, but just enough to get people's attention is what I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree with what both Tricia and Andrea have said. So hard to add much to that, but something I found actually really helpful for myself is actually going in there and remembering, although I might be feeling different, actually there's a lot that we've got in common and a lot that we connect on as well. And actually forming some genuine connections with colleagues and peers, and actually spending time to work on building those relationships is really helpful, actually, for getting your voice heard. Because you don't always need to be talking over people in a meeting or cutting in. Actually, you can have the quiet conversations on the side that then help you to have that place in the meeting with a bit more confidence, and you know that you've got some support around you from the others that you've connected with, whether they are other women or whether they're men, people who may have initially felt different to you. Actually, once you do start to bring yourself and be a bit brave to be authentic, actually, if you connect with people as yourself, actually, that's a very powerful thing.
Some comments in the chat. I will be going to, I see this is a comment, so I will be going to the chat and questions later. Thank you very much, Joe, also for the comment. We were commenting also during this chat. In some occasions, it feels that when you are the only person that is different, you are there like a token as someone. So how you can make sure that you are not there because you are a token, you are there because you are equally valid to anyone else there. So that's one of the things that we were talking. And then we also were mentioning how to be assertive when, and also still being authentic. And I think one of the other that we're saying, and it also is, not only going back to when you are, it's not only that you are not a token, but when you are the only one different in the room, you have a different kind of perspective. So how we can make sure that are also taken into consideration. So let's say the flip question, when you are the only one in a different in one environment, like women in a male-dominated environment, how you make sure that you keep being authentic and respectful for being good at what you are, rather than just being the person that is different? How you balance that out? And also how you make that people who are all from an homogeneous background take into consideration a different kind of background. I mean, maybe it could be also interesting if you can tell us an anecdote where you have felt in a similar position. I'm going to keep the same order, so that's fine. So Tricia, I'm going to go again with you, then Andrea, and then Joe.
Great. So I'd like to build on what Joe said around often you'll have advocates in the room, you'll have relationships with others in the room, and we do know that there's a lot of men who are championing women in these environments, and I think it's important that you know who your audience is. But equally, we also know in a consulting setting that customers are trying to solve gnarly problems. And if you hone in on the sameness while you're in the room together, as opposed to the differences in your backgrounds or you know, male, female, etc., then you're really just thinking about the customer problem and what they're trying to solve. And we all know that products and services are being made now for a much wider audience. So for me, it's about bringing that into the conversation as opposed to the kind of gender conversation or the difference conversation. It's about creating that environment of sameness in order to focus on the question in hand, which, as I say, in consulting is generally around what is the customer trying to achieve. So it's a good setting, I think, for women to have their voices heard. And then using that difference when you do need to say, let's look at this through a different customer lens. And then, you know, whilst it might be myopic to use just yours or just a colleague who also in the room may be underrepresented, you are starting to focus on how you change the dialogue for the customer, as opposed to just trying to have a conversation about the differences in the room. And I tend to find that that's helpful. Equally, this is a true story. It's not my story, and I'm sure the person that I'm sharing it on behalf of won't mind. It can be quite challenging, I think, in the generational situation. So a colleague of mine, very senior, often terms were used, which I can't even kind of bring myself to repeat, when they were addressing her. And so as a consequence, it was almost like, oh, they're there. You know, we all kind of have experienced that at some stage. And her retort was always, you're really struggling to remember my name, aren't you? And it just cut the conversation to the quick, because it was a case of, you're trying to diminish me, and as a consequence, I'm going to kind of challenge you in a very gentle way. And quite a lot of times she found that situation would occur. So it's finding that way to throw back the situation without making it particularly aggressive, but by the same token, just not ignoring it, and having colleagues during that meeting or after that meeting to say that was actually inappropriate. And I do have my own story where I have stopped a meeting and said, I'm actually going to stop this meeting. I think we would all agree, would we not, that was inappropriate? And you galvanize support, and the problem actually goes away. It goes away, as long as you have enough people in the room who are supporters and who are advocates for difference and not for sameness. So those would be a couple of the anecdotes that I'd like to share.
Thanks, Tricia. I think having advocates in the room is really important, and if you want to get your voice heard, or sometimes it's actually asking people before the meeting to say, oh, do you not have an opinion, and ask them to say that in the room, and it helps you get your voice there, and that you can be heard. But also the important thing is, if you hear something that is remotely discriminatory, you have to call it out. It's not easy, I know, but if you don't call it out, it will continue, and sometimes it escalates to get out of control. And this is where, for me, microaggressions come into play. And it's those small things that mount up to a cut, death by 1,000 cuts, because you lose the will to fight. So if you don't call it out, then you just get drained. And we've seen it in politics, and we see it all over the place. It's not just in consultancy, it's actually, unfortunately, in our world culture, that people just have those small little jibes which seem irrelevant, but actually can actually have a major impact on people. So for me, it's really important that anyone, and then it can be, and we've seen it with people of color also. It's not just about women and people with the trans community. Everyone is getting called out, and we need to stand together to say, you can't, that's not right to do it. You can't let that be overlooked. I think there's probably other things I could say, but I'm conscious that I say things and then Joe goes, well, I wanted to say that too. So I'm going
We've had too many conversations, Andrea. I think we share a lot of ideas with each other. So likely you will say something that I was thinking.
So I'm going to hand to you, and then if I think of something else.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Andrea is saying about calling it out, it's really important, but in the moment it can be really scary, actually. And some moments, actually, you freeze and you don't manage to call it out. And I think it's important to kind of be forgiving to yourself as well, and realize there's actually lots of different ways that you can call things out if you do experience a microaggression, especially if it's something that's directed directly to you. It can be quite tough to stand up for yourself and actually be effective in that. So actually being kind of prepared before meetings, like we talked about, having your advocates knowing actually this is the kind of situation that might happen. If you see this happening, can you please be ready to kind of call it out or support me or to reinforce what I'm saying? Because, I know that, X always talks over me or kind of claim my ideas as his. Actually having people who can support in the room makes a massive difference. And sometimes you can arrange the meetings a little bit differently, so ideas can get shared in advance, for example. So actually it democratizes a bit what gets said. It's also completely possible to then go and have a quiet word afterwards if you don't manage to call something out in the meeting. So there's kind of lots of different ways that you can approach it if those situations do happen. But kind of on the positive side of the meetings, I think it's well worth just being really prepared before you go in, know what points you want to make, what you want to bring into the room. And having your kind of advocates around you who know that that's your topic, and they can help you to bring it in as well. This conversation's reminded me of a story actually quite early in my career when I was still in a technical role, and I found myself in a meeting that was probably about 20 men. All of them were senior to me. There were some very important customers in the room, and I'd been having a conversation about one of our pieces of technology and how it was applying to their situation with one of our technical consultants who was taking the lead on it. And the conversation was kind of veering towards that topic. And actually, I was very nervous in the situation. But because, this other consultant knew this was a topic that I wanted to talk about, he was able to say, oh, well, Joe's got some interesting information that she can share about this. And he brought me in. So I was then able to talk about, this particular tool that we'd not brought in to the conversation before that point. And actually, it was very relevant to the kind of shared goals that we all had with this customer. So they were very happy to bring the conversation in. And it was actually a great way to be able to come in on a point that was important for the topic in a way that didn't really feel kind of jarring and having to say, oh, can you include me? Can I speak up as, this junior woman in the room feeling a bit intimidated? Actually, I was brought in as somebody who had some expertise on that topic. So be prepared, know your allies and advocates. I think that's really helpful.
I agree. It's knowing your subject is actually key to your success.
Yeah.
And being, as Tricia said, being prepared. But also I think it's about building strong relationships, and particularly with your clients. And your clients can act, because quite often it may be just you who's placed on a client site or dealing with it with your client. And by actually having a good relationship with your client, and sometimes those one-on-one situations are really beneficial, because they can feed back then into your organization and enable you to actually get a whole load of positive recognition that you may not have got if you were part of a wider group.
One of the techniques, sorry, Andrea.
No, I was just going to say, then the other is, if you are the only female, then ask where the others are. Be brave.
Very good point. I was just say one of the tools that I've used to good effect, if the room is open to it, is silent sprints. So you kind of pose the question and you allow everybody that space to write their ideas down. And it really works well for mixed rooms of extroverts and introverts, but it equally works when you have people who often feel they don't have a voice, because you give them that voice. Really good for small groups and large groups. And I've used that to good effect to get the room recognizing that those that don't often speak up have great ideas, because once you've posted all the notes on the wall and had a chance to review them, it kind of starts to build that confidence in others that often are silent in a kind of full speaking meeting.
And a similar technique that groups I've facilitated have used is a reflective pause. So if it's a smaller scale thing than actually being able to submit post-its and detailed ideas, but just a conversation, actually just a minute's reflective pause for people to gather their thoughts first before they speak can be really helpful to help people who are more introverted or feeling less confident to actually get things together before the melee starts. Everyone is trying to contribute.
And it also works for people who are neurodiverse as well, because having that lots of noise is sometimes really distracting for them, and actually having a few minutes where they can actually get their own thoughts in order is really important too.
Makes absolutely sense. I wanted to bounce because we've been talking.
Sorry, can't quite hear you, Antonio.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Right. Apologies for that. We have been discussing about how to not be a token, and we have been moving towards microaggressions. And now we are also involving quite a lot of when you are introverted towards you are being extroverted. And I think not only when you are a woman or when you are for a different background, but also when you have a neurodiverse background with you, all things can combine a lot, and perhaps the wider group is expecting you to act in a different way, and you have additional pressures for you. We were commenting on this area. It could be that some of them are microaggressions, and it could be that in other cases it's just people disrespecting things that they may not expect. This was one of the questions that we were discussing there when we were talking about the questions. So I just going to bounce it to the panel. I don't know if any one of you wants to go for the question first. Is it clear? Do you have any questions about the question?
I didn't understand the question. So, if you could say it again, please. Yeah.
So, in some occasions, we expected that most women are quite socially savvy to handle, but it's an additional expectation to expect that women will be able to have these social skills to handle certain occasions, we were saying. we were mentioning like negotiation tactics or influence. So how do you see that the combination when someone a part of being in a different background, like being the only woman in the room, a part of that, if you have or you find you have a different background, like in terms of diversity, that you struggle with social aspects. Both things together can combine, and it's like I think it was like a cocktail Molotov, right? Where you are expecting quite a lot of additional things in terms of social, like we were talking before. I mean, it's important if you have some microaggressions, being able to call them out. So when you have a neurodiverse background, you might not be able to realize of that situations. And I think we were engaging. Is it the question more clear now? No.
It was quite a long question. I think I'm just good at the little ones. I can talk in general on the topic. And I think that
maybe we should start that way.
It's very common, isn't it, that people have got different expectations about you than you feel you bring into the room. I've often, I don't know, I guess surprised people, so it can work in a positive sense as well, that people will then be surprised that I actually understand the technical aspects and can talk about it, and that can be quite helpful. It's like, oh, she does actually know this, and you can get into more in-depth conversation than perhaps people had expected in the first case. So it can be very productive and a pleasant surprise. But it can also go the other way when people don't actually hear the technical things that you're putting in because of their assumptions, and they're assuming that actually you know less. Maybe it's more lightweight, so that they're not really understanding that this is an important contribution. And that can be very frustrating. I think some of your comment, Antonio, as well, not just on the technical side, but on the more soft skills side. And a situation I've certainly come across a few times is for neurodiverse women who maybe don't display so much of the sociability that neurotypical women do. They're not showing all of the kind of social niceties. They can be really harshly judged for it, and actually people can be quite hostile, I guess, in the way that they then react to that. I think that's a particularly challenging situation to navigate, especially for women who are neurodiverse.
I think it's people's attitudes to people with neurodiversity is very gender specific. And on top of that, women mask there a lot more than men. So you don't always know immediately that a woman is neurodiverse, and so, but culturally, societally, where you go, oh, he's just a guy, or he's got a problem, and we accept it, and we don't actually do anything about it. If a neurodiverse person is quite abrupt in their delivery, they're then considered rude, and it's being aware of how we as society are impact in the workplace. Some of those things that we actually say and do, and some of those things unfortunately go back to childhood, and the decisions that we make in the toys, and isn't she sweet, and isn't he, all of those sorts of things, and the toys and things that we give children. So I think it does reflect, but I think we also need to stop ourselves before we comment. That would be my biggest advice is, we don't always know what's going on for someone. Whether it could be a trauma, it could be, it could be an actual diversity that is hidden, and we just need to just stop and think, oh, actually, maybe I'm being biased. And I think the more you become aware of your biases, the better everything is, because you don't rush in and make snap decisions.
I think that kind of emotional intelligence and active listening skills are both really important now, aren't they? Actually being able to listen to what someone's really trying to communicate, which, might mean taking them very literally at the words that they say, or it might mean actually understanding some of the emotion behind what they say, depending on who you're talking to and what they're trying to say. Actually being able to navigate those conversations is a really important skill, very important for inclusion.
I also think that we have to permit ourselves the right to say, I don't own that, actually. So I was recently in a meeting, and after the meeting, somebody said, he felt you were quite aggressive. And I said, that's really interesting, because my approach was quite assertive. And in a different setting, that's exactly what would have been acceptable. And I said, so I'm kind of going to challenge that. I know the difference, and I was being assertive. I'm not owning that comment. It's actually that person needs to reflect on the fact that they're not used to being in a situation where they're talking to somebody who does know how to be assertive. So I think there's also, as women, we must give ourselves permission to say, I don't actually own that. That's your bias talking. It's not really what happened. And I think supporting each other in that is also really, really key to breaking down some of these barriers. Because it's very easy. Again, it's a microaggression, isn't it? Oh, well, she's quite a bit hard hitting, that one. No, I'm just able to speak up for myself. And I think those are the kind of things those little jibes that just keep us constantly going, or was I, or should I, or maybe. And very soon after, you're the one leaning back and saying, well, I ought to not say that because they might think I'm aggressive. No, that's what you think as opposed to what's actually happening. So it's also, I think, when there is more than one woman in the room, it's supporting each other and saying, if you do see that behaviour, to actually talk to the other person and say, yeah, you were, or you actually were not, which is often the case, isn't it? It's often the case that it's the bias that's being applied as opposed to what's actually happening.
I've seen similar coming from women themselves, actually. So women who work in different disciplines, particularly, don't necessarily have the same cultural expectations about how work gets done as women working in tech or men working in tech. I certainly found for myself that when I transitioned from being a woman in tech to being an engineer, then working in the HR team to support more cultural things, I was perceived as very abrasive, and they think that they've smoothed off all of my rough edges after joining HR. Things are just different. It's a different culture from the tech teams to the HR teams, and what I was doing worked in the tech context. Maybe wasn't entirely appropriate always in the HR context, but it was what was needed in my previous context and worked well. So I think the context matters a lot.
It does, and I get accused of being bossy sometimes by men. And I say, well, I'm just trying to be very clear on what it is that I want. I'm articulating and letting you know. I'm making sure that you understand my expectations of you, and it's not that I'm being bossy. I just want you to understand what's needed to be done for us to deliver something.
Thank you for bringing the topic of assertiveness. I find I didn't realize about how much important is I think the topic with for many women, and many I see that they are trying to become much more assertive, and many others have the opposite problem. They are assertive, but when they are assertive, they get the feedback that they are aggressive, as you were saying. And so evolving any additional recommendation regarding assertiveness, so I think on the one hand, you were recommending you need to speak out, you need to be assertive. You need to call out when you have a microaggression, you need to call out when you know your stuff, and you cannot be quiet. If you are quiet, well, you cannot be quiet. You have to speak when it's right. But on the other hand, many of you have come up with this issue of, because you are assertive, you are coming off as aggressive. Can you expand a little bit further? just going to allow you to. I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, some advice that resonated with me. I think it was just a podcast I listened to years ago. It was just a little phrase that struck with me. That it was a woman in tech who was presenting, and she said, I always make sure that I'm trying to be kinder than I feel, and that kind of struck me actually. So when I'm communicating, is it coming across kindly? I might be direct and I might be assertive about it, but I want to make sure I'm still kind and I'm still coming across as a relatable person. So for years I always signed my emails "kind regards" to remind myself to go back and check, actually, is this kind? I think I've probably internalized it enough now that the kind regards doesn't get written anymore. But actually just having that sense check for yourself, actually, how is this coming across? Am I actually considering the receiver of what I'm saying appropriately, has been quite an important thing for me to learn.
Thank you.
I think it goes back to the earlier comment about being authentic. I'm one of 4 girls, the youngest of 4, and my ability to be assertive came from do that or really get nothing, even as a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old. So it was kind of, but in a female setting, interestingly. So I think it's around, it is who you are. And I think, Andrea, you quite rightly said at the beginning, the first piece might not be as authentic. And, we know many women who were taught to drop their voice to command the room. But once you've got the room, then you can actually revert to your natural style of speaking. And I think it's just managing those techniques. It's like most things in life, isn't it? We build the muscle memory and we kind of know how to manage the room. But I also think in every meeting there is a chair, and there is more and more emphasis on a chair actually managing the circumstance and the situation. And I think that certainly in meetings I've been in, if I've thought there's been situations, it's the chair that I would go to, and I would reflect with the chair to say, this isn't actually going as we would want it to go. People aren't being heard, and that is their job. So every meeting tends to have the organizer, and often that is the advocate that you really want in the room, isn't it?
The other part is, you can be assertive, but put yourself in the shoes of the receiver and think, is this how I would like to be spoken to? And you can be assertive, but you can soften it with a smile, or you don't have to go in like a regimental sergeant major. You can actually deliver your messages in a kind way. And I think understanding how what you're saying may be received, and also look at how it's being received. If you notice that someone is retracting or feels uncomfortable, then the ownership is on you to say, does that not resonate with you? Do you not understand? Because it could be a complete misunderstanding. And nowadays we work with so many different cultures that it's really important to actually make sure that it's understood correctly. I mean, at one stage when I was living and working in Norway, I had a Norwegian and an Indian guy. Both came to me absolutely livid with each other because the other didn't understand what they were trying to say in delivering some implementation. So I sat them down and I got them both to say their pieces in front of each other. And I said, okay, I'm just going to summarize and reflect back what I think I've heard you both say. And they both went, yeah, that's what I said. And then they both realized it was because they were using English as a second language and they were using it slightly differently, that this was where the misunderstanding had occurred. And all of a sudden they became best friends and were able to move on. But it was really, you really have to be conscious of that, about how you're delivering your message. And that's how it can come across, where you can be. And think of another case now where I've worked with a client I've never worked with Bulgarians before, but they felt that they wanted us to tell them where they were going wrong, and they wanted to focus on the negatives, which for me as an optimist found quite difficult. I'm wanting to move on. They go, no, tell us where we've gone wrong. And so learning to adjust your styles to particularly now in consultancy, you're going to be traveling. Well, you won't physically travel, but you'll be traveling virtually around the globe to talk to different people. And so, yeah, think about what may be assertive here in the UK may not be assertive to someone in another culture.
Thank you. I see that there are 2 questions in the room. Sorry, in the chat. I don't know if anyone in the room have any questions. Just going to be relevant for that now for this topic. So there is a comment saying that it came often, as you were mentioning, that when many women communicate assertively, they come across as bossy, or as you were mentioning, aggressive. And this is something that I'm realizing more. I'm going to connect that question later. First, I'm going to go to the other question in the chat. Because I was not aware that for many women, when they communicate assertively, they get the feedback that they are being aggressive. And I assume that many other men were not aware as well. So how you can make your advocates more aware of these kind of circumstances, or how to be a better advocate. And that goes back to what Andrea was saying about know your relationship, your advocates. Before going into that, I'm just going to go, I see a comment from Emma regarding have the panel ever encounter or witness a direct discrimination or bias in the consulting work? How do you handle it, and how do you support your colleague? I'm going to go a little bit more farther than that, because it's not going to be only discrimination, but also I guess that you will see regularly microaggression. You might see people not behaving in a proper way with this microaggression. So going to hear from, I'm just going to go again as to the panel. You are doing a much better job than myself, and you're speaking quite orderly. So I don't know who wants to go to take the first turn.
As a diversity and inclusion consultant, I guess I should probably start. And I do see these things, but it's my job to see these things, and I tend to get called in when they happen as well. So kind of within client teams, they'll talk to me about challenges they've had within their team. Almost certainly it's a private conversation to start with, with the person involved who's experienced it, and then with the person who has caused the situation as well. It really is very situation dependent though. As I was mentioning earlier, sometimes even as a diversity and inclusion consultant, something will happen in a meeting that is quite clearly a microaggression, but it takes everybody by surprise, including me. That does still happen, unfortunately. If you spot it, you can just sort of say, when you said this, actually, this is the impact it had on me. Would you please, change your approach for the next time? And I think explaining how it's impacted you rather than speaking up and putting words in the mouth of the person it happened to is quite important as well. So it made me feel uncomfortable rather than, you made Emma think this or that or the other, when you don't actually know what she thought. But then you can also, like I was mentioning earlier, you can take it privately outside of the meeting later and handle it in a different situation outside of the immediacy of it as well.
I mean, I've witnessed it, as Joe said, probably too many times, but I think, go back to understanding your circumstances. And when I worked for a different organization, and there were consultants and contractors there, and one person said something that the majority of the room found funny, and they all fell about laughing. But there was a woman in the room who didn't see the funny side of it. And she felt uncomfortable all the way through the rest of the meeting. But when the meeting finished, she did come to me and say, you know, I really didn't appreciate that. I thought it was a derogatory comment to women. I didn't actually think that, personally, I didn't find the comment derogatory. I actually thought it was to do with multitasking. So I thought actually women do quite a lot of multitasking. So it wasn't, hadn't seen it myself in a derogatory manner. But I, having spoken to her, and I understood, you know, how it was, and then getting the guys to understand how that had impacted an individual was really important to play back when we went back after lunch, so that they understand. Because if you don't explain to people how that's impacting someone, how are they going to change? It will keep happening. So, you know, when I say speak up and call it out, and even if you're not comfortable doing it, then find someone who can help you articulate it and bring it back, because otherwise it will just carry on.
I think leaders can be really important in those situations too. You've reminded me of a situation, Andrea, where a client had requested a different person who was a man to work on a project. And what you really need then is your leaders in the consultancy to say, no, that's not appropriate. That's not our company values. We're not going to, work with you on that request, because we don't believe that. And actually having that, I guess, clear values and guidance, and the leaders actually stepping in and saying, no, we're not going to honour this request because that is discrimination, is really important. You know, they need to be aware and they need to be ready to do that.
I mean, when I was working for this other company, and one of my colleagues got invited to Chelsea football ground to meet a particular group of top 100 consultants, and he went along to see these consultants, and he looked around the room and he said to the organizer, I'm going now. And they said, but you've only just arrived, you know, we've got so much to show you, you can have a proper tour of Chelsea and things. And he went, well, he said, I can't believe that you've got your top 100 people here and there isn't a single female here. And so he left. And it takes true leaders, male and female, to stand up and call it out. So I have seen it in consultants.
Yeah, I think we have a comment in the room.
If the example, Andrea, that you gave about there was a room of people and someone made a joke and everyone was laughing except that one person, might that also be where you have to understand, as I think Tricia or Joe had mentioned, that they didn't understand the English language well enough and so may have misinterpreted something? Could there have been a language?
In that particular situation, I don't think it was a language situation, but the individual was a sensitive person. Okay. And so, yeah, sometimes you just have to understand that people react differently to different comments. It was not, I'll leave it there. I'm not going to.
Thank you. That's fine. Yes. Thank you.
I think it's also interesting. There's an element for me around patterns of behaviour. And when you work in an organisation, you kind of get to know that people's behaviours. And one of the things that we're more and more understanding is stress behaviours. And, you know, there's no question our industry is stressful. You know, we work under kind of strict deadlines and to budgets and so forth. And I think there's an element of pattern here as well, because I've seen evidence of microaggression that's come out of fear and frustration when somebody's under immense pressure, which is quite different. And it's not what they've said, it's how they've behaved, which is quite different to somebody proactively and actively aggressing against a colleague. And I think that's also something to watch for. And when we talk about neurodiversity, and we talked about sometimes it can come across as quite blunt, and So it's having that element, as Joe said, of kindness and what might be behind that. And if you see somebody who's never really behaved that way, suddenly starting to behave in that way, we all have very complex lives and we don't always know what's happened 5 minutes before that meeting occurred. So I think for me, it's also an element of pattern. It's not every single thing every single time. It's, hang on a second, that person is an absolute advocate. You know, they champion women in the workplace, but they're behaving in a way that we've not seen before. So I think it's really important to keep that approach as well, and keep listening, as you said, Joe and Andrea. Keep your eye on that, because we don't know what goes on in people's lives. And from a sensitivity perspective, sometimes we feel more sensitive than others, and sometimes there are triggers that we, you know, somebody says something, it triggers one person, and the other people say, I don't know what that was about. So I think there's a modicum of sense, but really being sensitive at the same time. And that's not in any way to accept, you know, clearly outrageous behaviour, but it's more that kind of sense of this isn't commonplace and this person does not behave like this. So what else might be going on for them? And
I can
making sure that we
give an example of that. So, as we all do these Teams and Zoom sessions, and there was a colleague of mine, and I looked at them, and they didn't look right, and their behaviours were not typical of them. And afterwards, I pinged them and said, "Are you okay?" And she went, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well," and listed off a whole load of things to her. And she hadn't realised that she was actually suffering from stress. But I could see it all manifesting in front of me. And she had just been battling through it all for lots of different reasons. So, yeah, exactly what Tricia just said. We don't know what's going on in people's lives. And so sometimes we just have to say, call it out and go, actually, something is not going on that's normal here.
So find out what the problem is, as opposed to call out the behaviour.
And don't do it in front of people. I've seen people say, and I get really annoyed when people go, "Oh, you look tired today," well, or "You don't look like you're in a good mood." Well, that's a good way to put me in a bad mood. So, you know, don't impose your view of the world on someone else, is what I would say.
We have a nice gender balance in our workplace, and quite often we'll talk about, we have a couple of young dads in our business, and sometimes we see that kind of exhaustion and stress levels, and we often say, this isn't a female domain. We don't know their family setup. We don't pry in. If they want to share with us, we're delighted, but they could be the main, you know, family member that gets up in the middle of the night every single night. It's an assumption, again, that's back to bias around, well, they're the dad. And, you know, the world's changed, the world's moved on. So we often talk about, are we bringing bias into this conversation? Are we looking at this to say, well, they should be perky, no, they're a young family. They're a young family, and young families can suffer from exhaustion, which can lead to stress. So I think it's also calling out your own bias, as you said earlier, Andrea, that you kind of need to understand that sometimes your own lens might be the one that's actually causing the problem and not solving the problem.
I saw a comment regarding additional tips for assertiveness. Any additional tips? Yeah, we have the other question that I was mentioning regarding how to make your advocates more aware about things that could be relevant. For example, going back to assertiveness, as we have the comment in the chat, sorry. In many cases, men don't realize that could be an issue for women. So what will be, on the one hand, what are the advice, the tips for all the women that wants to go into leadership in terms of improve their assertiveness, and also things to watch out to improve the assertiveness. At the same time, to don't get it against yourself. Yeah, going to let the panel speak.
I found in my early career mirroring. So neurolinguistics was something that I studied at the time, and often to create that sameness and to, as we know, build that rapport. I found, because again, if you're in a group setting, if someone is leaning over you, standing over you, it's obvious. If you do the same back, it's like, whoa, it's like, actually, we've just mirrored each other. How did you feel? So sometimes mirroring can be a way of starting to raise awareness of what's actually going on. Body language has become more and more, because of the way that we all see the world, much, much more important than perhaps it's ever been. I lived in Australia for 12 years, and when I arrived, they said I walked too fast, I talked too fast. I was from London, and my feedback was really weak. When I came back to the UK, I walked too slow, I ate too slow, and I was brutal. And it was really quite interesting to see that dynamic, because of course I lived in my in the habitat, and I became part of that community. So I think, this concept of mirroring, this concept of knowing your audience, there's this kind of idea around staying authentic and true to yourself, but leaning in and drawing people to, as opposed to asking them to make the change. So I've always found that quite useful in my career.
Yeah, I love that. Drawing people in is really, really key, isn't it? And like you say, it's very different how you do that if you're in London or if you're in Australia. Not that I've experienced being in Australia, but brilliant story. I think knowing the outcomes you want from a situation is really important to keep that focus on it. That really helps to then know what you're drawing people to and what you're asking of them. It can be very easy to get, pulled around by all the kind of ebb and flow of the discussion, but actually going in with a really clear picture of these are the outcomes that we need from this meeting or project or whatever the circumstance is really helpful for actually kind of directing, what it is that you're asking of people and being very clear about that.
I don't really have much more to add to that, what you both said, and you don't actually have to go all the way to Australia to see the difference in walking. I can remember, I grew up in the West Country, and I had some friends come to visit in London, and we all have a tendency to walk down escalators and things. And I looked round, and he wasn't there. And it's like, where is he? He's still at the top, looking at everything and taking it all in. So yeah, knowing where you are and what's appropriate is really important.
I saw a few comments, but perhaps I think the comments were from Kerry. Kerry Green is mentioning about removing padding words as well, and also I think and things like that. Also, she's mentioning don't say sorry. I guess the way that I have heard about that is don't say sorry, say thank you. What's your view? I have had some additional tips of this type. What are your view of? Do you have any additional tips like this one? But I understand that mostly the biggest bit of encouragement to gain that assertiveness is know your subject, know your audience, know your advocates, as you were saying. Right?
Yeah, I think it's important that we don't always curtail and kowtow to people and say sorry for being late, sorry for this. If you become apologetic, then you're weakening your stance, and people then go, well, they obviously didn't have much to say. They make their own assumptions because you've started with the sorry part. But I do think it's important that other people recognize your feelings. So when when Kerry says something about I think, it is important that people understand how you feel, and the impact that what someone else is saying is really important. So that part I do think is important.
And I've noticed that men have no problem with saying I think blah blah blah, and people still listen. So I'm all in favour of equality in terms of what we can say.
Yeah, our voices are equal, so
they are. But I think it's also very powerful to use evidence, isn't it? And I agree with the concept of. So I now say thank you for waiting for me. I don't say I'm sorry I'm late, because again we know that's a very poor way to start. But more around, I'm inclined to use statements that would say, well, I think such and such, and the evidence would suggest that that's correct because. And so bring that concept of logic back in. I think it, but I've evidenced it. So we should be fairly clear that we're going to, accept that to be true. And so I've always found that really powerful. And that really only happened for me. I studied very late. I didn't have a chance to go to university, and I studied very late. And I was very intuitive in the early part of my career. And I would use the I think, but I was thinking it from an emotional perspective and from experiential perspective. And instead of saying my experience tells me, I said I think, which doesn't sound as organised and it doesn't sound as well considered. And I started to say my experience coupled with the evidence suggests this, and I'd like to pose that as an idea. So again, it's back to that, how do you language and how do you impactful language, I suppose, when you've got an audience that you haven't been able to command. Once you've got your advocates and it's more using those. But when you haven't got that, when you're in a room of people you don't know, I found that to be quite useful.
I like that.
I do too. We'll take some notes.
Yeah, I might have to steal that one, Tricia.
No, that's a really good one.
You can't copyright it now. It's out there.
Shucks.
One of the questions that I was mentioning is we have tip on it, but in terms of raising awareness, not only about assertiveness, but about many other kind of devices. When you have one from a different background in the room, everybody else are not familiar with that background. So we might be saying something silly. We might be having bias. We might might not be aware of peculiarities that might make that person feel uncomfortable or have an impact on them. What tactics, and if you can also tell us an anecdote or part of your memories on how you can make a difference, bringing allies and helping others to be aware of things that could be an issue or an inconvenience for you. I know that I'm not always very clear. I say checking. Is the question clear, or is
It's a bit. It's too long.
Yes.
So it's quite hard to unpick some of it. So are you asking us about not just from a gender perspective, but from other perspectives in general, can sort of layer up how people interpret things? Is that what you're saying?
Also, I mean, mainly the focus of today would be women in male-dominated industry, but yes, also in a broader sense, when you are someone or of a diverse background or a different background to the dominate environment. So yeah, and in this case, the sample will be more clearly if you are getting into a meeting and maybe everybody's talking about football and you have no idea.
Yeah, the Lionesses did very well, thank you.
There's a bias joke, wasn't it? The football didn't come home, so we had to go and get it.
Yeah.
That in and of itself had a bias to it.
Yeah. So, and yeah, I need to rethink my answers.
But if you want to take it a different perspective, I don't know if Tricia or Joe will want to take a first take anyway.
I think it goes back to culture. We know in consulting you go into other organisations, you go into other environments, and you'll have contractors working potentially with you. So you've got more augmented teams. But I think if you come from a very strong culture and you feel you have a voice, then, as we've said earlier, you have avenues to address some of those issues when you are finding. I mean, we're starting to see in the press a lot around the drinking cultures, and we had that very, very sad situation with the young woman who was in the M&A situation in the law firm. And that's really raised awareness about how culture can influence the way we see ourselves and the way we see others. And I think it's important that an organisation is very firm with its culture, particularly when you are not working in your firm. And this is a conversation, again, we have in consulting a lot, that you spend probably 60 to 80% of your time in somebody else's environment. And making sure, we call it go rogue or go native or reverse, it's actually how do we create those anchors to bring people back to the sense of what we believe is right and fair and the values that we stand for. So you gave a description of you walk in and there's a lot of chatter about something that clearly is biased towards a gender or another. And if that's uncomfortable for people and not creating that team dynamic that gets the job done, then that's what you're calling out. You're not necessarily calling out the chatter. You're calling out the fact that this isn't creating an inclusive environment for people to be their best. And in our world, customers are paying us to be our best. So there's often a way to come at it from a different lens that says we're not talking about the chatter. We're talking about this not engendering a feeling of success for everyone who's in the team, regardless of their background, their gender, etc. That's really another lens to apply to it.
Yeah, I would say that.
Oh, sorry, Andrea.
Yeah, very quickly, it was just to say that, it's about creating a psychologically safe environment for people to work and for them to turn up and be their authentic self. And, think of a colleague who is part of the LGBTQ plus community, and in consulting, you're moving from client to client. And it can be quite exhausting because they say feel like I have to come out every time that I change clients, or I can't be myself, or I have to put on act in a particular way whilst I'm on this client and so it is really important that we create the right environments, and as consultants, I think our clients look for us to provide that guidance. And if you see something isn't working that is inhibiting you doing your consultancy properly, then you have an onus to call it out with your client and say, if this doesn't change, your culture is preventing us from moving forward.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say builds on that actually quite nicely, is that sometimes it can be quite hard to pinpoint like where there's a cultural difference that's causing something. And just like a trigger thing that I find in my own head is helpful is if I find myself thinking they should have done this or I should have done that, that should word, it's like there's some different assumption there under the hood. And it's time to get a bit curious, that's a thing to interrogate, where does that difference come from? And then that gives you some hooks to hang on to actually understand maybe where some of that cultural difference is and start talking about it. And
the same as when we do consulting delivery work, we talk about in our retrospectives what that puzzles us. And I've always found that word to be very good. You know, if you ask somebody something's puzzling me, it's a nice soft conversation as opposed to kind of confronting something. So it puzzles me that you're seeing this or you're saying that or you're doing this. Can we talk about that? It's much, much more gentle than I've observed this. What are you doing? You know, that does sound quite confrontational and perhaps not lead to the positive outcome. So some of the words and the language you use in consulting is really helpful, I think.
Well, language definitely is important in consulting. Yes, I saw that we have a note in the chat. Yeah. So in terms, I mean, you are quite senior in your career. You have seen I'm probably sure that you have seen quite a wide, diverse evolution or degree of evolution. The world today, I feel it as much more inclusive workplace and much more inclusive environment. Perhaps it's not as inclusive as it should be, but it's possibly better than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago, or even that. So have you seen a significant shift or a significant change in terms of a more welcoming environment, the consultant workplace for women? And do you still see that there are additional challenges? Where are these challenges more into when you are getting into more leadership position, or they are also at all the different part of the spectrum? I was hearing before Joe commenting, when you are in IT, it's easy to communicate. You can be direct. People don't take it that. But when you are in HR, people are more susceptible. So what are your views? How much different is the world today of what it was before, and how much challenges we still having in the road?
We have a lot of challenges, I would say, still. I do agree that it has moved, but the dial slightly. But if we look at the ONS stats, we see that, you know, from an IT perspective, we are still battering around the 20% mark, and we drop a few percent, we increase a few percent, but for the last 20 years, we have remained around the same mark. So I do see changes, but there are other challenges that we face. I think we need to question what it is that needs to be done. And one of the ways that I think we need to do is actually track exactly what's going on within your own organization. If you don't actually track it, it doesn't get done. Particularly, I've realized in consultancy, if you don't have it there as a goal that needs to be achieved, people are like more concerned on winning new business and getting their utilization up to date and all of those sorts of things, rather than actually looking at how do you increase diversity in your teams, which will only at the end of the day help and improve your opportunities to win and to be innovative. So yeah, we need to monitor it, but it needs to come from top down, but I think equally from bottom up can also push too.
I think I agree in terms of monitoring, it's holding yourself to account. There are more small businesses in the UK than there are large, really. And actually some of the rules don't apply in terms of reporting. So GPG being one of them. And actually that doesn't really help the situation and doesn't help the challenge. I know in many countries, I don't think I've seen it here yet, some countries have started to do the October-November pens down. So women won't work on a particular day. They say, today is the day that I stop getting paid in comparison to you. And I can't remember which country started it. I have a feeling it was Australia. But it's quite a powerful message that says, I'm not being paid in November and December. You are, and I'm not. So there are different ways, apart from reporting, that you can raise awareness. But I think for small businesses, and we would count ourselves as an SME, we actually publish our statistics, we hold ourselves to account, we have measures in place, and we hold each other to account. And I think more organisations that do that, then we will see a seismic shift. But whilst there's a kind of concept of only certain organisations need to report, then we're not seeing the full picture.
Yeah, I think probably I have quite a different perspective on this as an inclusive innovation consultant. Actually, an awful lot of my, I tend to work with associates. My business is tiny, but an awful lot of my associates will be other women actually who are working kind of in IT in kind of roles about ethics or, the kind of people dimensions of it. So I think one thing that has changed more actually is just with the expansion of tech, actually, there's an awful lot more types of role in tech now. And there's a lot more opportunity for being an AI ethicist, for example. And actually kind of recognizing that that's opened up opportunities for people to work in different ways as consultants in tech, I think is really interesting.
I like the three comments and put them together. I think it's interesting that we are getting what stick to my mind is that thing of calling out. And if we see that, for example, we have a place where everybody is from the same background, the ability to make normal to call that out, so everybody start watching that out. So I really liked how you have been putting it. For the next bit of the question that we have, I want to move to the second topic, which is challenges getting into being a woman to getting into consulting, and we mentioned a little bit about that. So how you can get into consultancy, and that's going to be a challenge not only for women; it's going to be a challenge for everybody. Normally, people decide when they are young they want to have a degree. They may want to become an architect, a doctor, a fireman, a policeman. Not many people came across into I want to be a consultant. And normally, the background of people moving into consultant is people that has been more senior in their career. So, in your view, in your career, you have been getting into consulting at different levels of your career. Some of you have it more clear. Some of you have came more late into consulting. What would be the advice for women and in terms of helping address challenges that you have seen getting into consulting? I'm going to give a couple of seconds so you can think the question. Let's talk too much.
I think it's about transferable skills. And I think it's identifying where your skill set is best placed, and then pursuing opportunities to organisations who recognise that. I know we're talking particularly about tech, but consulting more broadly, they've introduced a chartership, which clearly articulates the different aspects of what it is to be a consultant. And I think that's going to be really helpful for women going forward, not specifically in tech, but more broadly in consulting, to see how many of the skill sets, they don't always actually turn up in work. They can often turn up in other parts of your life for us. And I think it's important to recognise that. I mean, we very rarely take people who come from a consulting background, and we would be now probably female heavy. And we are actually trying to address that and think about, that wasn't our diverse approach was on purpose, but I have a leadership team that's all female. And we have to question ourselves around what does that mean? When we sit in our management board and there are females around the table. So there's some positive aspects and some outcomes there, but it's looking for organisations who have been set up on purpose, who are actually championing women in the workplace, championing diversity in the workplace. And there are many, many companies now, and that's the starting point. If you go to some of the more traditional organisations who use traditional methods, of course it's harder. But when you get your name known as a consultant, as I'm sure Andrea and Joe have in their careers, when you're known, you tend to have those companies come to you and not the other way around. So it's kind of starting your career in a place where you are safe, where you are psychologically safe, and when they will invest in your skills you already have, and then moving from there.
Well, I definitely did things a bit differently and started out as a consultant by starting my own business. So Inclusioneering's only about 3 years old. I took the leap after being an employee for 20 something years. I want to do, I want to work more broadly and help more organizations, and actually consulting is the way that I have the opportunity to do that. I have to say it's been challenging without a doubt, because, doing it on your own with lots of skills still to be learned, you've got to learn on the job. So I know how to deliver the work that I deliver, but in terms of building a business and growing a client base, there's been lots to learn. But like you say, Tricia, there's lots of transferable skills that you bring to it, and you kind of work out, how do I bring this together, and you find a way through it. But certainly challenges to overcome with filling in, all of the areas that you've never actually done before.
Yeah. And I'm not a career consultant either. I came from industry into consultancy, and I've only really been doing it for 2.5, 3 years. So, but for me, what I was doing before, and that is the link back to the transferable skills, was that in the organization I was working for, I was doing a lot of internal consultancy. And those skills were then something that I could then bring to my current role.
Going to join this with the third topic that I have prepared, we had prepared for tonight, which is successful consultants, and what are the skills that are successful, and the trends that also you see in the industry. What a successful consultant, what are the skills of that a successful consultant will need?
We talk about consulting T in our world. You can be broad, or you can be actually a specialist. But for sure, we look at things like problem solving, active listening, being able to present information, because we talked a lot about being in a meeting and have yourself heard. But a consultant needs to make recommendations that aren't always received in a way that's expected, in the sense of you may have to challenge a customer. And I'm sure, Joe, you come across this a lot. And whilst they invite you to do that, they're not always ready for what you're going to tell them. So we look at skills like that. And relationship management is critical, because that's stakeholder management 101. So again, it's back to those skills. We look at those skills mainly. Being able to present information, being able to problem solve, critical thinking, and being able to present information back. And I think we see more and more, we have clients who say to us, and one in particular comes to mind, we followed a larger organisation into a customer, and they said, so we'd kind of like to talk to you about this idea that you go in a room for 12 weeks and you come out and you go, ta-da, look at our 100 slides, look what we know about you. And we laughed, because we have a mantra, work with, not do to. And so, again, it's about, we look for people who take others on a journey, and you do the reveal and a slow reveal and a slow burn and a slow. And actually, the most successful consultants will often have the customer say, this is what I think I should do. And it's like, okay, that's really interesting. Yes, I agree. And actually, all that they've done is adopted your recommendations over the period of time that you've been working with them, but you've left them with complete ownership. And that in and of itself is a skill. So those are the types of things that we look for.
Thank you.
I think you've covered most.
I know. What else is there to say, Andrea?
Sorry. There we are. Look, I'm sorry. Because I genuinely am.
No, I think your communications is the key part. And so if you want a successful career in consultancy, then communications at all levels and in all mediums is what I would suggest that you look at. And as one tip from someone from a different consultancy to the one I work in, he had joined another consultancy and he was very, very frustrated because his boss kept rejecting his slides and he didn't understand why they were doing it. It was only when it got blown up to 200% that he realized that it was like a millimeter out, which when you're doing it on your laptop doesn't look very much, but when you're putting it on an enormous screen, it's really noticeable. So I would also say attention to detail. Yeah, one of my pet hates is if something isn't in the same font all the way through. People get distracted by the things like that, and they don't actually look at the content anymore. So, yeah.
I would say, sorry, just to add to that, the concept of we have double eyes on everything. And we do that because people don't always want to, or don't even notice that they may have a level of dyslexia and or to communicate that. So we take that problem away by saying everything has double eyes. And so, you know, and the only challenge I've had, and it actually happened to me, was somebody who was dyslexic checking the work of somebody else who was dyslexic, which was it was an actual thing, and we went, that really wasn't a good idea, was it? It didn't really work. So now we have to rethink that strategy around double eyes. But it did start the conversation, and as a consequence, it was almost this tumbleweed, followed by this revelation of people going, and me. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Right.
We're at time.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So yeah, actually we are time, but just going to check if we have any questions. First I'm going to go in the room. Do we have any questions in the room? Yeah.
Yeah, please. Especially since COVID, we've interacted a lot more on platforms like Zoom. So have you found that kind of environment a leveler that neutralizes bias, or does it actually have the opposite effect and amplify bias and raise new challenges that you don't have working face to face?
Definitely creates new biases.
Yeah, I've found similar. I mean, although it has some benefits, yeah, there's definitely some new potential for bias that comes in from it.
There was some research around video interviews done a number of years ago, and they saw the drop-off rate of female applicants was really high. And that goes back to, you know, I don't know, I don't look in the mirror very often. You can see I'm going dark, I don't have a light on. But this I found really confronting when we first started to operate this way. It's not common to me to see myself a lot. And even as somebody who I would say relatively confident, I found that quite a challenge. And I'm not suggesting it's just a female trait, but I think there is an element of that as well. People certainly in the early stages, were quite intimidated by seeing their face on a meeting. I've never sat in a physical meeting with a mirror in front of me ever, and this is exactly what this is. So I do think we've had to overcome quite a lot of challenges working this way.
I think now things are becoming hybrid. That adds another dimension to the challenges. You know, there's all of the dynamic of the people present in the room versus the people, you know, connecting in remotely. You know, the people who need more flexibility, you know, typically the people that will connect remotely, and they're the women, they're the people with disabilities and neurodiverse colleagues. And that can then create a barrier for proper kind of inclusion and participation. So I think the hybrid world is one to take a lot of care in.
Any other question? Yeah, fine. Any other question in the room? Going to give an opportunity for people online. Going to couple of seconds to see if anyone online wants to add anything else. Otherwise, I'm going to just give an opportunity to each of the panelists to say a last comment, advice for females to jump into that, and advice also for advocates to help to champion diversity for women as well. I don't see anyone else commenting in the chat, so I'm just going to continue for the closure. So yes, last word for just going to go as I see you in the panel in the Zoom. So I'm going to go with Tricia, then Joe, and then Andrea.
I'd just like to pick up on a few things that were said. I think Joe's absolutely right in terms of kindness. You know, first and foremost, we are beings, as in the humankind, and the word kind features there too. And I think it's really making sure that we support each other, whatever and however we turn up. That would be really where I would kind of like to end this session.
Well, I'll just say that for me, consultancy has been a very exciting career move. It's given a lot of flexibility that's been a real enabler for me, and actually working online has been a real enabler as well. So a lot of the things that are challenges are also big positives too. And for anybody else who's thinking about becoming an independent consultant, actually it's very collaborative. You know, if you're worried about working alone, that isn't how it's panned out at all, actually. It's a very collaborative business. And that's a great pleasure.
My tip would be is to, if you're struggling to get your voice in the room, find an advocate that can help you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the last comments. Thank you very much for the audience online and the audience in the room. Thank you, all panelists, and I just want to wish you a nice rest of your day. Thank you and good night. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Jenny.
Thank you.
Okay.